Salvete vos. Hello, everyone. I'm John Coleman from Apacus de Stacy's, an Institute for the Humanities and Alternative College and High School here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. The purpose of this broadcast is to get into Toynbee, tiles and all. This is our cycle class, 8 of 10. My goodness, where does the time go? What is the cycles class, you ask? This is a course we have here at Apacus de Stacy's looking at the long term, over thousands of years, meditation as to what moves history. Does history, in fact, move at all? Different minds have said different things, going back even to the classical world. And we've looked at various figures, such as St. Augustine, Ibn Khaldun, Giambattista Vico, Hegel, looking very stern and very German. We've looked also at Spengler, and now going decidedly in the, shall we say, Atlanticist or globalist camp, we now come to Arnold Toynbee. If you're interested in this topic and perhaps even in enrolling in the course, I encourage you to check out this page here, which has some of the preliminary discussions. Of course, the classes have in-person live discussions as well, along with appropriate preparatory readings and AV recordings. Okay, so here we are, and here is our man for today, Arnold Toynbee, hailing from a time in the first half of the 20th century to the mid-20th century when men still dressed as men. A shirt, a tie, a jacket, and a vest, and a pocket square. And you could even, I guess he's being informal here, you could actually even put a collar bar on that collar. Does anyone know what a collar bar is? Well, maybe if I show up on the camera, I can dig up my collar bar for you. I'm probably the last man on earth that still actually wears a collar bar. Even Toynbee in the mid-20th century didn't have such. Let's see if I can. There we go. Nope. Hold on. I get you the collar bar. Almost had it. So nowadays, our collars, if we even have collars, have typically buttons that connect them. Believe it or not, collars to shirts did not always have they were not always sewn together. You actually bought them separately. Anyway, these are collar bars, so they would hold down the wings of the collar behind the tie there, and it would have the effect of making the tie more pronounced. Now, in any case, fashion concerns aside, what Toynbee is valuable for us today is his historical analysis. Now, I had mentioned he is one to be classed amongst the globalists, and it has to do with the people who are financing him. Now, Toynbee publishes a 10-volume set called The Study of History, and as you might imagine, it takes him quite a while, several decades, to produce this. Now, what's interesting, if you look behind me here, I will often make reference to a similar 12-volume set, when all was said and done, entitled The Story of Civilization. And whether it's Toynbee's Study of History or Will and Ariel Durant's Story of Civilization, you can see that people 100 years ago had certainly longer attention spans, and also the interest and the money to fork out for these volumes. Now, Will Durant and Toynbee are very different authors, although I do have a photograph of them meeting. I have both of Will Durant's autobiographies, one he did rather young to be writing an autobiography in his 30s, and then one in his uh, 70s, I think late 70s or early 80s with his wife. But anyway, there's a photo in one or the other, probably the second one, of him meeting Toynbee. But very interesting that in any case, you could have a market for such a complicated and long writing process. Different time, I'll tell you. In any case, uh, Toynbee is, unlike Durant, much more of a philosopher in his analysis of history, which is not to say that Will Durant wasn't a philosopher and doesn't get into that, but Toynbee has a thesis that he's trying to prove in this, and that's why he was hired. So we're going to learn about that, and uh, well, this will give you an idea of the people that were backing Toynbee. Time magazine, especially at this point, mid 20th century, might as well be synonymous with the CIA, and that's without any exaggeration whatsoever. And you can find volumes of the study of history, which we're going to look at, still mucking around. The 10 volume set is going to put you back quite a bit. It's not in print, and certainly an original set is not easy to come by, which is also another difference compared to the Durant series, which is even now dirt cheap to buy the 12 volumes, even put together. You can get them most inexpensively, and that has to do with the fact that the story of civilization was given away basically when you signed up for, I think, Books A Million. It was a kind of something they would throw in, as opposed to the study of history. And you'll find me tripping over these titles because they're similar. The story of civilization, the study of history are kind of similar titles. So do forgive me there. Now, like I say, you're not going to really get physical access to the study of history very easily, the 10 volume. But what you can easily do is get a copy of the 2-volume condensation abridgment of this. And this is my first introduction to Toynbee. I have these 2 volumes in the garage, in the book boxes. And I would say probably 5 years ago at this point, it was during COVID-19, maybe 4 years ago, we did a whole class just on the study of history. And a great introduction it was altogether. I certainly remember a lot from that class. They say the best way to learn something is to teach it, and a lot of things stick with you in that process. And actually, Toynbee thought at the end of his life that Somervell's condensation was actually better than the 10 volume because he really encapsulated in brief the full set. And sometimes you can say more with less. And Toynbee mentions that in the introduction to this abridgment. Okay, but what are we talking about? Well, first, let's see who we're talking about. So we'll get into a little biography here of our man, and then we'll get into his specific theories. One of these tabs has a chart. I hope you appreciate that after 2 months of studying historiography is the fondness we historians have, and you classmates and people listening to this have after all this time of charts, sometimes very formidable charts indeed. Okay. Now, this is entitled, before we even get into bio, Toynbee Tiles and All. So I can't tease you too much more, can I? Let's learn about the Toynbee tiles. This is a kind of a quirky, queer place to begin. Toynbee tiles. What the hell are these? Let's see. What is it? A Toynbee tile refers to a message and a medium invented by a Philadelphia artist in the 1980s. This site, the entire website, explores the story and meaning behind the work. So if you go actually all over America on the streets, there are these strange decals all across the country, and they're called Toynbee tiles. And they have this cryptic message on them: Toynbee idea in Kubrick's 2001 Resurrect Dead on Planet Jupiter. And these are affixed all over the country on the asphalt, with a type of tar. I think these are, how do you say, tire patches. So they're very, very tough. The actual material that this artist, or artist, is kind of mysterious, whether it in fact is just one person, has. And so once you attach this tar to the asphalt, which is a type of tar, it doesn't come off. And so these things are extremely durable, these so-called art pieces. In 1993, the website creator was heading to the arcade with a pocket full of quarters when he noticed a Toynbee tile embedded in the asphalt near 16th and Chestnut Streets in the center of Philadelphia. In that moment, it put me on a path that culminated in my participation in the Sundance Award-winning documentary Resurrect Dead: The Mystery of the Toynbee Tiles. The film led to a ton of interest in the tiles, and this site was subsequently created. So where are the Toynbee tiles? So it's kind of a mysterious, quirky thing named after an historian who is largely, even by the 1980s, uh, been forgotten. And yeah, I mean, part of that, we're going to get into his ideas momentarily. Part of that is that the reading public simply, well, isn't as robust as it was. So therefore, the memory of authors isn't as robust. Part of it has to do with a big change in history as a discipline in the second half of the 20th into the 21st century. But what an abstract thing, isn't it? To have these Toynbee tiles named after this figure. So I'll just read a little bit more here, and then we'll get into our guy proper. So one of the questions we often get at the website is, did you ever put the tiles on a map? The thinking behind the question begs some Hollywood-style grand conspiracy, like, what was the Nicolas Cage movie, Da Vinci Code, right? Remember the books too? The scene would play out like this. In some dimly lit room, the intrepid Resurrect Dead team pins tile locations to a giant wall map. As we finish, the camera pans back to reveal a giant arrow pointing to buried Illuminati gold. The tile map is nowhere near that earth-shattering. More than anything, a map of 600 Toynbee tiles reveals a startling degree of detail. The travel pattern of a Philadelphian with the habit of dropping breadcrumbs all over the eastern half of these United States. We see regular trips down the shore. We see preference for Route 1. If we look close enough, we can even see a habit for Dunkin' Donuts trips to Midwestern cities, show tiles starting near the highway, trailing through downtown, and jump back on to the next ramp out of town. It's no coded message to some wider revelation, these Toynbee tiles, but they're still an interesting look at life through 100 points of data. So here are your Toynbee tiles, mostly in the mid-Atlantic states there. If dressing up is a lost art, anyone remember the mid-Atlantic states? Remember when New England and the mid-Atlantic states were a thing? It wasn't just all the Northeast. Anyway, we see that Arnold Toynbee was born at the end of the 19th century. Certainly a time for meta history, about the same time as Spengler, if you'll notice. And he left this mortal coil in 1975, long after Spengler. He was a British historian whose 12-volume analysis of the rise and fall of civilization, a study of history, was a monumental synthesis of that subject. A meta history based on universal rhythms of rise, flowering, and decline, which examined history from a global perspective. He's a globalist, get it? A globalist perspective. By the way, the years that are given, 1934 to 1961, are, of course, the years that it took to write this. So we're looking at a little bit shy of 30 years. Toynbee approached history not from the perspective that takes the nation state, very popular 19th century model, or ethnic groups as a unit of history, but civilizations as a unit, taking into account the roles of religious traditions worldwide. Rejecting a natural deterministic view of Oswald Spengler, who similarly explained the rise and fall of civilization and the decline of the West. Toynbee introduced the concept of challenge response. This is critical to understand the study, of history. See, I'm tripping up already. The study of history, the challenge and response. This is the key. Remember Ibn Khaldun? The key to Ibn Khaldun was asabiyya, social cohesion. Remember St. Augustine? The key was virtue. What explains the rise and fall of the Romans? His immediate study. The Romans were virtuous, and they were rewarded in this world with that. Kind of a very Deuteronomistic understanding of success and failure that you see in the Holy Bible. Interestingly, Arnold Toynbee was a very, very heavy reader of the Holy Bible. I don't recall his religious affiliation properly. I think some sort of Christian is fair to say, but I do not know. I might suggest Anglican, just given the time and place he lived. But in any case, he was often seen reading the Bible. So, in any case, that's going to rub off on your understanding of history. In any case, the challenge and response is the key to Toynbee, just like our other scholars have their keys. Biography. Toynbee was the nephew of the economic historian Arnold Toynbee in the 19th century, for whom he is sometimes confused. Born in London, Arnold J. Toynbee was educated at Winchester College and Balliol at Oxford. He began his teaching career as a fellow at Balliol in 1912. Not for nothing, he's living, much like Spengler, at very fortuitous times. Maybe not fortuitous is the right word. Very momentous times, certainly. Right on the eve of the First War. And thereafter held positions at King's College. Interestingly, notice he was a professor of modern Greek language and modern Greek history and Byzantine history. And, here we go, the London School of Economics and the Royal Institute at Chatham House. Right? So these are big globalist combinations, even in the time of Toynbee. So I think the London School of Economics is well known. Very, very powerful group of Fabian socialists. And Chatham House is what we call the CFR today, the Council on Foreign Relations. And they publish still a journal, which if you're interested in geopolitics, regardless of your politics, is worth reading. And it's called Foreign Affairs. You can read Foreign Affairs every other month, and you will know what the globalists are up to. So this is the world that Toynbee was running in. Doesn't make him good, doesn't make him bad. It's just something to note. He worked for the intelligence department of the British Foreign Office during World War I, interesting, and served as the delegate to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. So this is a man who is very much involved with world events. With his research assistant, Veronica Butler, who was to become his second wife. He was the co-editor of, again, that's going to be the Royal Institute of International Affairs, is the CFR. He was the Co-editor of the CFR's, RIIA's Survey of International Affairs. In 1936, Toynbee received the Reichskanzler by Adolf Hitler. Interesting. And during the Second World War, he again worked for the Foreign Office and attended the post-war peace talks. Okay. So let's learn about Toynbee's ideas and his approach to history. Toynbee's approach may be compared to the one used by Oswald Spengler in The Decline of the West. He rejected, however, Spengler's deterministic view that civilizations rise and fall according to a natural and inevitable cycle. Go back to Spengler. Remember him? Bald guy? Spengler, when you think of his idea of history, you think of a bag of fruit. There's a bald guy too, but that's not the one we're after. As a future bald guy myself, I have to show some solidarity, don't I? There we go. There's Spengler. When we think of Spengler's historiography, think of a bag of fruit, right? Each fruit is separate, but each fruit goes through its own genetic process, its own natural cycles, independent of the others. You may have noticed this if you cook or anything. You'll have a box of tomatoes. What do they call it? There's a word for that when you get a it's not called a punt. I think it has the P sound. But when you get a little thing of blueberries or strawberries, you'll notice this especially with strawberries. One will be moldy, but even the ones it's touching are not mold. The other strawberries, for instance, that is touching are not moldy. Why? I don't know. But what I do know is that each of those fruits is going through its own cycle. So you may have a perfectly healthy blueberry next to literally a moldy blueberry, and it's its own little world. That's Spengler, and there's something of that in Toynbee, but there's a rejection of Spengler as well, right? This deterministic view. Toynbee presented history as the rise and fall of civilizations rather than the history of nation states or ethnic groups. He identified civilizations according to cultural rather than national criteria. Thus, the Western civilization, comprising all the nations that have existed in Western Europe since the collapse of the Roman Empire, was treated as a single whole and distinguished from both the Orthodox civilization of Russia and the Balkans and from the Greco-Roman civilization that preceded it. With the civilization as units identified, he presented the history of each in terms of challenge and response once again. So this is the key for Toynbee. Civilizations arose in response to some set of challenges of extreme difficulty. When the creative minorities devised solutions that reoriented their entire society. Challenges and responses were physical, as when the Sumerians exploited the intractable swamps of southern Iraq by organizing the Neolithic inhabitants into a society capable of carrying out large-scale irrigation projects. Or the challenge might be social, as when the Catholic Church resolved the chaos of the post-Roman Europe by enrolling the new Germanic kingdoms into a single religious community. When a civilization responds to challenges, it grows. When it fails to respond to a challenge, it enters its period of decline. Toynbee argued that, quote, civilizations die from suicide, not by murder, unquote. For Toynbee, civilizations were not intangible, unalterable machines like Hegel, but a network of social relationships within the border and therefore subject to both wise and unwise decisions they make. If leaders of the civilization did not appease or shut down the internal proletariat, or muster an effective military or diplomatic defense against potential invading outside forces, it would fall. Now, let me take over the screen here and try to clarify this, because it is a little bit more complicated than some of the ones that we've looked at already. And he happens, of all the scholars that we've enjoyed, Toynbee happens also be the one that I know the most about. So this theory of his has a number of moving parts, and those parts can be exchanged. Now, before I go on, I just want to reorient all of ourselves into the fact that as good scholars and students of history, we want to understand that none of these individual thinkers has all the answers, nor have they claimed to have all the answers. Part of the takeaway from this course is to not to find a synthesis between all of them, although I'm sure Hegel would approve, but rather to see that there are dynamics of human life and social life that they all press on. And for those of you who might practice any number of pre-modern religions, I think you can understand what I'm saying. If you practice a religion like Christianity or Judaism, no single saint or rabbi or imam or whatever, no tradition, no single tradition of Hinduism speaks for the whole religion. This is very normal if you think of pre-modern thinking. And I suggest as we try to orient ourselves in this course that we understand that Toynbee, Augustine, Vico, Hegel, etc., we take that kind of ancient sensibility to it and see that all of these guys have something to offer, and just because there might be a disagreement amongst them doesn't mean we have to choose one over the other. But in any case, what we have with Toynbee, as I said, he has many moving parts. So in every civilization, and he lays out, I think it's like 20 or 25 different civilizations in the 10 volumes that are condensed in the 2 volume that's still in print. And they all have a challenge. Now, the challenge for Toynbee can be any number of things. It can be military, it can be agricultural, there might be a famine. It could be geographic, like the Eskimos, they live in a formidable environment. It might be a disease, whatever the case may be. That all groups of people on this earth will have a challenge. And those groups of people that go on to form proper civilizations meet the challenge, whatever the challenge may be. The killing part is usually the second, third, fourth, or fifth, and so forth challenges, if a civilization even survives that long, are not, these subsequent challenges are not of the same nature as the original. So if a people will move from being non-notable into some sort of notable civilization, there's a challenge and they survive it. So the example we'll use is Rome. Rome in the 2nd century BC is faced with a military and civilizational challenge from Carthage, and vice versa. Carthage is faced with a challenge from Rome. And there's a series of conflicts called the Punic Wars. Rome ends up dominating and, in fact, annihilating Carthage in this struggle. So for Toynbee, and he does use this example, the challenge has been met. However, the subsequent challenge that Rome faced, wealth, Rome was not able to overcome. And this is the case for other peoples as well. It may also happen that a people meet the challenge but do not conquer the challenge. So if the challenge defeats you, like Carthage was defeated by Rome, well, you don't exist anymore. Or you scrape by, as like Spengler would say, like Fellaheen, like just you're living in like this twilight zone. I don't mean twilight zone like sci-fi, but you're living in this twilight world where you're living in the shadow of the pyramids that, you know, were built thousands of years ago, but your civilization has clearly declined, right? Modern Egypt can't build those pyramids, or modern Greece for whatever reason, lost the spirit that made it so remarkable. So you have people living in the shadows and in the wreckage or the ruins of these previous civilizations. So you can be overcome by your challenge, and you're a non-entity, or you can defeat your challenge. But the one that I'm trying to introduce here is you can also stall out. You can meet your challenge and survive it, but you never overcome it to become a proper civilization. And the example in this scenario that Toynbee uses are the Eskimos. The Eskimos are a people whose challenge is the environment. In all their history, the Eskimos have not been done to death by the environment. They have accounted for it and continue to survive. However, in order to do that, all their energy is expended in building igloos and kissing each other on the nose and killing seals. They really like killing seals. The Eskimo civilization has stalled out in survival mode. Their challenge is environmental, and they have never overcome that. They have met the challenge enough to survive it, but they have not become strong enough to overcome it. And many other extreme environmental peoples are similar, especially in the hot climates. Think of southern India or equatorial Africa, right? These are peoples that are just meeting it. Okay, but in this scenario, and Toynbee looks at dozens of these civilizations, in the scenario where a civilization meets a challenge and they overcome it, there's another dynamic at play altogether here. Is the challenge and response, but then also with Toynbee, this is why I said there are many moving parts to him. Also with Toynbee, there's the concept of the border and the internal proletariat. And for Toynbee, so often the challenge comes from either one or the other of these, either an outside foe, the border. There's a problem on the border. It doesn't have to be military. That's probably the easiest way to understand it, but it could be a host of things. It could be an economic system that's crashing or being embezzled or whatever. It could be disease. It could be all sorts of things. But there's something from without the civilization that presents a challenge. Or, Toynbee says, there is a class of people within the civilization that is discontent and that rises up and replaces the order heretofore. And they become the new civilization and rinse and repeat. And once again, the existing order, when what he calls the internal proletariat rises up, and however that may be, there's all sorts of ways that can happen. It doesn't have to be physical. But when a group of people within the body politic assert themselves, once again, the challenge and response is at play. Either the civilization defeats the internal proletariat, it stalls out trying to control them, or it is overcome by them. And in the case of Rome, that internal proletariat are what we call Christians, who were recruited initially from the down and outs of society, from the slaves, from the women, from foreigners, right? These are the people that went in for Christianity originally, leaving aside some outstanding wealthy people like Flavia Domitilla and apparently people in Nero's court and things. But by and large, the Christian movement was a low caste movement that eventually grew and grew and grew until it replaced the Roman Empire, East and West. Now, Toynbee, as we saw, was a professor of Byzantine history as well as Greek history. And a similar thing happens to the Byzantines, meaning they're overthrown ultimately by an internal proletariat. Well, actually, hold on, I take that back. The Byzantines are overthrown by a border proletariat, and that is to say the Arabs, the Muslims. It takes a long time. But the caliphate eventually conquers Constantinople and therefore snuffs out Rome from human history. So actually, the Christians would be an example of an internal proletariat overcoming a civilization, and the Muslim Arabs would be an example of an external proletariat overthrowing a people. Okay, so let's get back to the screen share here and carry on. All right. So, what were the influences of Toynbee? Well, I'll tell you one right off the bat before we read this. Also, his own experience at Paris 1919. I happen to be reading Winston Churchill's memoirs of the Second World War, and Turkey and Greece and Albania figure at the part that I'm reading. And I was wondering, in the First World War, the Ottoman Empire at that point was allied with Germany, and now they're allied with England. And I caught myself and kicked myself in the behind because, of course, they flipped. Because Britain flipped the Ottoman Empire using these exact same dynamics, right? How did Britain topple the Ottoman Empire in the First World War and create the modern nation state of Turkey? Because it played exactly on the internal proletariat. The Ottoman Empire was ruled by a minority of Arabs, and the Ottoman Empire was ruled by Ottoman Turks, and the Arabs felt disenfranchised and were disenfranchised, and it was they whom the British used, Lawrence of Arabia, right, using all the tribes in the Hejaz to overthrow the Ottomans, or at least to really speed up that process. Oddly enough, then allying with the rump of the Ottomans that went to form Turkey, and then carving up the corpse of the rest of the Ottoman Empire for the Arabs. In any case, Toynbee was involved in this. So you're wondering, like, what are the influence? Well, there's one. Toynbee was at Paris 1919. Okay, anyway, Toynbee's ideas have not seemed to be overly influential on mainstream historians. So this is his subsequent influence. Comparative history, to which his approach belongs, has been in the doldrums, partly as an adverse reaction to Toynbee. Interesting. Canadian economic historian Harold Adams Innes is a notable exception. Following Toynbee and others, Spengler, Kroeber, Sorokin, Cochrane, people that might be on our syllabus in future runnings of this course, Innes examined the flourishing of civilizations in terms of administration of empires and media of communication. However, Toynbee's overall theory was taken up by some scholars. For example, Ernst Robert Curtius must have been a well-mannered guy, but a sort of paradigm in the post-war period. Curtius wrote as follows in the opening of the pages of European literature and the Latin Middle Ages. Following close on Toynbee as he sets the stage for his vast study of medieval Latin literature. Not all would agree with his thesis, of course, but his unit of study is the Latin-speaking world of Christendom, and Toynbee's ideas fed into his account very naturally. And there's an extensive quote here. Now, talking about his influence, I want to go back to something I mentioned, namely, and you can even see it on the spine of the books here, these are published by the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and nowadays they're called the Council on Foreign Relations, and they publish Foreign Relations Journal, Foreign Affairs Journal. And the people who hired Toynbee, I've called them multiple occasions globalists, they hired Toynbee in the 30s through the 60s. And there was something these, what we call globalists, were interested in. They did not call themselves that in those days. Neither do they call themselves that now, incidentally. And the question was, and this is what Toynbee was fundamentally trying to get. He was a man on a mission. He was hired to Study this question from the CFR people. Could it be possible that a civilization not collapse? That was the question and the hope on the part of the Royal Institute here. The hope was the answer would be yes. And how could that come about in the mid 20th century? Well, Toynbee's whole theory is challenge and response. What would happen if the two dynamics that always created the challenge were neutralized? Think about that. Every one of the dozens of civilizations Toynbee studies from the ancient world to the modern world, they all fell because a challenge arose on the border or within an internal caste. What happens if there is no border? Gee, I wonder when that comes about. Well, that's post World War II. After World War II, Western culture is the world government. Yes, there are still flags and borders and national armies and all of this, but fundamentally, after the Second World War, liberal capitalism is the world kingdom. There is no border anymore. In fact, some of you might recall a very popular book in the early 2000s by, oh, what was his name? Was it Milton Friedman? The World is Flat? Who remembers that book? Thomas Friedman. Hey, not bad. Not bad. I still got it. Thomas Friedman. The World is Flat. Right, a globalist book, and his whole kind of shtick, and this is what sticks in people's minds, as he pointed out, the two nations that have a McDonald's have never been known to fight a war. So, and it was talking about, globalism, which was the hot word in the 1990s, economic globalism, that is. In any case, that's what the CFR is wondering. Okay, if we have no external border, really, after the Second World War, liberal Western capitalism dominates. That only leaves one other option for a problem to arise, and that is the internal proletariat. So the second question is, if you have the border neutralized, there is no problem that will arise because there is no border. Everything is just capitalism and the bar association. That's the system. You can have turbans, you can have dots on your head, you can wear jeans, you could wear leaves, right? There are still these superficial aspects of difference, but substantively, the administrative mechanism is exactly the same throughout the world after the Second World War. Okay, then how do you neutralize the internal proletariat? And you can do that a number of ways. You can drug the now, Toynbee's not saying this, right? But you could neutralize the internal proletariat. You can make them happy, right? You could tap into your Aldous Huxley and Brave New World. You can give them soma drugs. You can intoxicate them. You can spray them with chemicals. You can neutralize the population so that you will never have a problem from them, not a real problem. And so the takeaway from Toynbee is that you could have, and this is, of course, the whole globalist plan since then, carried on militarily by all sorts, but carried on intellectually by the likes of Francis Fukuyama and his End of History essay after the Gulf War, and others as well. So, in a sense, that the liberal order, the people who were hiring Toynbee, is the final civilization, the mono civilization, and it will never be toppled because there will never again be a challenge on the borders because there are no borders, and there will no longer be a Christian movement that will arise. There will be no more Protestants, right? There will be no more internal group amongst the Jahili Arabs. There will be no more Islam arising from the Arab tribes to overthrow the existing Arab order, because we'll just castrate them in more ways than one. You can neutralize them. And that's why the people who were funding Toynbee to see, is that the case? And that was his ultimate conclusion. You could neutralize the two loci of the challenge. Okay. Interestingly, I came across a review of Toynbee by George F. Kennan, and Kennan was another post-war globalist. This was towards the end of his life. Although the old fella, I think he lived until 2005 or so. So he still had a good stretch before him. But Kennan, you'll recall Kennan in your Cold War history as the guy who sends the long telegram about the Soviet Union, and we got to watch out for those guys. He might be the first guy to use the term Cold War in 1946. Anyway, Kennan says, I knew Arnold Toynbee only slightly many years ago. Remember, they both were involved at the end of the Second World War, when he was a visiting scholar at the Institute for Advanced Studies. But I then knew very little about his work. I had just come from 26 years in the American Foreign Service. That's the State Department, what we call the State Department, where one read a great many other things, but very little, I'm afraid, about the history of ancient civilizations. I am sure that of all my colleagues at this institution, I am still the one who is least erudite in many of the things that Toynbee was erudite in. Want to just check the tech. When one talks today about this man, one has first to make it clear which of two things one is talking about. One is the popular image that was at one time formed of him in this country, America. The other is what he really was and did, living now in an age when, and in a country where, the image is valued so much more highly than reality. We are all, I am sure, well aware of the distinction between the two. As a curious illustration of what the image was, as distinct from the reality, I might begin by quoting the first introductory sentences of an elaborate 11-page article about Toynbee that appeared in one issue of, drumroll please, Life. Of course, Time Life eventually merges, doesn't it? Time Life, CIA, the Luce family, isn't it? Lucis Trust, all of that. Quote, a spare, blue-eyed Englishman named Arnold Toynbee, the Time Life says, was scheduled to arrive in these United States this week. He was headed for the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton, New Jersey, where he will resume work on one of the most ambitious chores the human brain has ever undertaken, his monumental study of history, unquote. Actually, the work of the Time Life concern in vulgarizing Toynbee's image in this country had been undertaken more than a year earlier, in March of 47, when Toynbee's picture appeared on the cover of Time magazine. Hey, there we go. Followed by the usual explanatory article in the pages of the same issue. And to explain Time Life's interest, one has to note the coming together of several apparently disparate factors. Nearly a decade earlier than that date, just before the Second World War, Toynbee had completed the first 6 volumes of what was to become many years later his 12-volume study of history. In these volumes, Toynbee had analyzed the dynamics of growth and decay in some 21 civilizations, ancient and modern, and he believed himself to have discovered in these phenomena certain patterns of development common to all civilizations, including, albeit with certain reservations, our own. Some 10 years later, a lot has happened. 1947, when the Time article appeared, there could have been very few people in this country who had read anything of Toynbee's 6 volumes. These were not exactly light summer reading. The war had intervened, but there was just appearing on the American market at this time a 600-page condensation of their contents done quite faithfully on independent initiative by another scholar. An advanced copy of this condensation has just fallen into the hands, had just fallen into the hands of Times editors. And of course, they're referring to, I should think, the D.C. Somerville ultimately two volume. Beyond that, Toynbee had then been lecturing extensively around the eastern part of these United States. This activity had included a series of 6 lectures delivered at Bryn Mawr College, which I think is an old female-only college in this country. These last, evidently, had been attended by someone very close to the publisher of Time, Henry. Oh man, my brain is not too rusty. Henry Luce, right? The Lucis Trust. Or possibly by that redoubtable gentleman himself. Now, to explain some of the things Toynbee was saying in his Bryn Mawr lectures, I have to remind you that the late winter of 47, was just the time when the British were confessing to our government their inability to give further support to the government of Greece in its struggle against the communist guerrilla enemies, and when President Harry Truman, in his response to this British approach, was not only offering to relieve the British of this burden and to assume it in their place, but was also extending in his so-called Truman Doctrine what was in effect an open-ended assurance of support to any and every other government across the globe that could show itself to be faced with opposition of this nature. So keep that in mind. It's not just Toynbee's time at the Treaty of Paris or his knowledge of the Byzantine Empire, but also he's living in post-war Britain, where Britain is broke and its empire is falling apart. So all of this, you better bet your bippy, as the British say. That's a lot of B's altogether. You better bet your bippy that this was pressing on Toynbee's final formulation of his theories. It is clear that Toynbee was deeply affected by these events. He saw in the shifting of this and other burdens from Europe's shoulders to those of these United States, what he called the dwarfing of Europe, quote unquote, and the beginning of a great struggle between the United States and Russia for world supremacy. He was a man who believed, as I must say I have never done, that world government from a single center was indeed a very real possibility. He was quoted as saying in the Bryn Mawr lectures that the early political unification of the world was a foregone conclusion. And by the way, you notice this, I definitely remember this from the study of history, that is another moving part that Toynbee lays out, is that you notice over the course of history that the consciousness of people is getting bigger and bigger. And the example he uses as a good Bible reader is Abraham and Paul. Look at Abraham, he says. He is Abraham of Ur, a single city in Mesopotamia. That is the consciousness of Abraham in terms of the people he is part of. It's the people from this city. And then Toynbee contrasts him with St. Paul. And yes, St. Paul is Paul of Tarsus, but Tarsus isn't a city so much as a designation. There is a city called Tarsus, but it's a designation of Sicilia, an area, a province. And in any case, Paul also has a consciousness of being a Roman citizen. His consciousness is not as a member, like Abraham, of a city. This is, 2,000 years later. Paul's consciousness is being part of a region and part of an empire. And you can even develop that further with the Christians and the Muslims, who have a very abstract understanding of belonging. They belong to a heavenly city in their respective mythologies. All of this, Toynbee points out, is a universal observation. And even in America, you go from having a consciousness of being a citizen of your state to being a citizen of your region to being a citizen of your country. Toynbee sees in this, and you can have all sorts of other examples, he sees all of this trending towards an ultimate consciousness of being a so-called world citizen. So you can see how his ideas are very copacetic to Fabian socialists and to globalists, to one world government sorts. And you can see how Toynbee is appropriate to certain discussions and power fractions in our day. But it was still a question, of course, of which of the two superpowers would come out ahead. The behavior of all civilizations, he thought, had been determined by a process of challenge and response. And so it would be with the rivalry between the United States and Russia. The Soviet aspirations were the challenge. America's reactions would be the response. America, he thought, had the better chances of winning this contest, but it would not be the material or even the military aspect of America's reaction that would be decisive. It would be the spiritual ones, Christianity to be specific. The relationship of Christianity to the other spiritual forces of our time would be, he said, the only effective response to aggression and would be decisive in creating the future of our civilization. And you can circle all the way back to our initial discussion on St. Augustine here. And Augustine has this idea. In one hand, very Roman, but also very Christian, of this universal kingdom. That's a very Christian idea, but it's also an idea in the physical that Rome had developed independently. And that's interesting if you read the book of Maccabees, the Hebrews the and the Greeks and the Romans, if you read the letters in the book of Maccabees, between them, they themselves, the peoples, the Greeks, the Romans, and the Hebrews, saw similarities amongst themselves. And you can see a certain synthesis that happens with Christianity. So you have Augustine's Christian vision as a historian of a universal empire. You know, here we are 2,000 years later, same idea with Toynbee. Maybe secularized somewhat with the United Nations, but still that idea. And it runs. That idea of a world government runs throughout European history. And a lot of it has to do with the abstract nature of Roman law and the abstract nature of the Roman state. It lets you think in these fashions. Well, I think we've had plenty to think about in our introductory remarks here. So I'll leave it to you to read Toynbee's Study of History. And then, if you're so lucky, you might come across a Toynbee tile when you least expect it. Let's see what they look like once again. Here we go. So you see the Toynbee tile. Keep your eyes peeled. You never know where you'll find one. All right. Very good. Thanks for watching. Thanks for thinking. And I'll catch you in class. Varete.